Good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are. In this video, we're going to talk about naming things in code. And we all know naming things is actually quite difficult. I've been in scenarios where it's taken me longer to actually find the name for a function than it has been to write the function itself. But luckily, we've got this naming cheat sheet by Ketanato, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, which I've gone through and I found really helpful. I'm going to add a link to this in the description, so check it out when you have some time. And let's actually go through it now to see if the tips are helpful. So we'll go through this one by one. Firstly, English language. Now this one I found quite interesting. What it says is whatever you name, it should be in English. So not Spanish, not French, not Chinese, in English. And the reason is English is the most widely spoken language when it comes to programming. I don't know how I feel about this. I mean, if I was French, I don't know if I'd naturally write all my functions and variables in English. I guess it takes practice, but this is what this guide says. And me being a native English speaker, and I'm sure people who are American watching this who are native in English will agree with this more. But if English isn't your main language, please let me know in the comments below if you agree with this point. I'm actually quite curious. Here for naming convention, it's not actually specifying a naming convention to use. It's just saying whatever you do use, just stick with it, which is something I agree with and I do for most of my code. SID, or short, intuitive, and descriptive. This is a point I think that comes with practice. I don't think you can read this and immediately understand it. But what I do take away from this is you shouldn't use single letter variables, although it's a bit difficult not to do this if you're writing a for loop, an array reduced method, or an array sort, where it's super easy to add A and B as an argument or I as an index. But I think it's good practice not to do that because your code is way more readable when you do not do that. Avoid contradictions. I think that bit makes sense. I won't focus on that. Avoid context duplication. This bit does kind of make sense. I don't think it's something I do that often, where you have duplicate names or similar names in the context it's defined in, but it's good to know anyway. Now, this is the most interesting takeaway from this whole cheat sheet, A/HC/LC. I had never heard of this before looking at this cheat sheet, but it does make a lot of sense. So this is useful for naming functions. A is the action, H is the high context, and L is the low context. And below are a list of some actions, not all the actions, but the most common actions that are used when naming functions. Get, set, reset, remove, delete, and so on. Now the higher context and lower context takes some time to wrap your head around, but a context is essentially the thing that is being actioned. So if you're actioning the Pokemon API, you're getting data from the Pokemon API. That's the thing that's being actioned. In my opinion, I don't think all functions need to have a lower context. So above here it says A for action, HC for higher context, LC for lower context. I think you can get away with just A and HC, which is done here. So get user. But of course, if you have a lower context like message or outside, it makes sense to add that there as well. If you take one thing away from this whole video, it's this part. I highly recommend looking at it and wrapping your head around it because it will make your process of naming functions a lot easier. So back to focusing on naming variables, there are these prefixes like is, has, and should, which are mostly useful for booleans. Min, max I rarely use, same with previous and next. This will make sense for pagination or an accordion or a carousel, something like that with arrows that indicate previous and next. And finally, we've got singular and plurals, which may seem quite simple, but can actually be quite difficult because if you have sheep and you have sheep, well, there's no plural for sheeps. So what do you do there? I think it makes sense to have names that can have sensible plurals. But anyway, let me know what you think of the cheat sheet, if it makes it easier for you to name variables and functions. I, for one, have definitely learned something from this. And as usual, subscribe to this channel and like this video so others can find it. Thanks for watching.